Okay, thank you kindly for the invitation to speak about Genesis, the fifth and last book of the Spiritist codification. But I think before we start talking about Genesis itself, it behooves us to have a quick look at the other four books of the codification, so that we can perhaps understand a little more why is it that was necessary for Kardec to write a fifth book. So when we look at the Spiritist book, for instance, the very first one, what we see there is the foundation of the doctrine, right? That's the philosophical book. Well, and then we move on to the next book, and we see there the mediums book, and there we also have a philosophical book, scientific in some points as well. But there, we are not talking about the foundations of the doctrine anymore, but we are actually addressing the issues of our interexistence. So what is that, first of all? We are interexistents, or interexistent beings, in the sense that we exist as a single entity, but we can live here in the physical realm or back in the spiritual realm where we started our journey. Because of this particular modus of living, this particular approach, we are interexistent. But it's not just that. It's not because we can be at two places, but the fact that we can be at two places even while we are in one or another with either a physical body or a perispiritual one. Here, when we are as incarnate beings, when we are going through a process of reincarnation, at night we can visit the spiritual realm. And when we are there as well without a physical body, we can also visit the physical realm. So it's this connectivity between the two realms, which we tend to separate very clearly in our minds, and does not exist. It is because of this particular approach that we say we are interexistent beings. And all the relationships that we see, that we through which we go, are related, are described in the mediums book. And then we move on to the third book, and that's the Gospel according to Spiritism. And we ask ourselves, well, we had already the Gospel. Why do we need the Gospel according to Spiritism? Was the first one wrong? No. There, in the Gospel according to Spiritism, we see in practice what Kardec laid out in the Spirit's book. So we begin to see that the books are paired up. We have the Spirit's book, and then its pair is actually the Gospel according to Spiritism. If you would allow me, I would say that the Spirit's book is actually the technical manual, where you go to learn. The Gospel according to Spiritism is the user's manual, where you go for the instructions on how to put those things you learn into practice. And then we move on a little more. Heaven and hell, right? We're pushing it to the fourth book. And now we see another pair of books, the medium's book, which is also the technical manual. There is where Kardec lays out all the concepts or the foundation for our interexistence. But where do we see the proof of it? Where do we see how to apply it? In Heaven and Hell, the fourth book, which this year is commemorating its 150th anniversary. So as you see, we have two pairs of books, not four books. Each one a technical manual and a user's manual. So we ask ourselves, well, so that's pretty good. Why do we need a fifth one? And remember that when I say Allan Kardec wrote, we know that it wasn't Allan Kardec who wrote it. He systematized, he consolidated, he harmonized the books, organized them. It was the spiritual benefactors that dictated all the answers, all the explanations that are there. And in some cases, Kardec even added his own explanations, especially when the topics were very broad, very extensive, and so on. But we know it wasn't Kardec that wrote them all. So when I say Kardec, please excuse me for that, and understand that I mean, of course, the combination of Allan Kardec and also the spiritual benefactors. So again, I ask, why should Kardec write a fifth book? We know that the spirits, the high order spirits, are extremely frugal with their words. They are not going to say anything more than we need. So why is that we need a fifth book? And we look back and we read the 4 books again and again and again, because you shouldn't read just once or even 3 or 4 times, all right? And we realize that there's one thing missing, something that screams at us, and yet we don't see it, because we actually take it for granted. There is nothing about God. And before you have a minor heart attack on your seats, yes, there is nothing there about God. There are 13 questions. The first 13 items of the Spirit's book are actually related to God, but not to God itself, but to the attributes of God. That God has to be perfect in every quality, that God has to have all the qualities, and this and that, but doesn't say what God is. Genesis comes in to show to us what God is, which is the very first thing that we should already brush aside. The idea that Genesis is about the scientific part of Spiritism. I hope that you keep up with me until the very end, or stay with me until the very end, and I hope I'll be able to convince you of this. So we're going to go through some scientific concepts. Like Frederico was just saying, people have a tendency to find that Genesis is very difficult. That's exactly because it has some scientific concepts. But hopefully, we'll be able to address these, right, without going into depth about each one of them, and see why they have to be there and how they contribute to our idea of God itself. So now let's start Genesis. Let's open up the book. And the very first chapter, I just said it's the book about God, has nothing to do with God. Kardec starts talking about revelations. What is a revelation? Which comes from the Latin word to remove from under the veil, to uncover, to discover, to bring into, to make it public to others, right? And they're all correct. That is what a revelation represents. But what is this related to God? Well, it is a long journey. And since the universe took 14.5 billion years to be put together, we have to be a little patient. I hope it's not going to take 14.5 billion years for us to get to the end of the book. But still, we need to have some patience. So it talks about revelations. It tells us, for instance, that when we uncover something, we are the first revealers, because we were the ones that discovered it or came up with the idea the first time. When we communicate that to others, we are first order revealers. We have an idea that we communicate to others. Those who learn from us and communicate to another group are second order revealers, and so on. So you can think of it like this. A scientist, for instance, who discovers something is the first order revealer. A philosopher, the artist, are first order revealers. Then the teacher, who learns from the scientist, who learns from the philosopher, who learns from the artist, as they teach the students, he or she is now a second order revealer. Those students, as they relate that to other individuals, are third order, and so on. And why is that all important? Because then Kardec makes it a little detour and start talking about these revelations and how we should approach them. And he tells us, for instance, that every revelation is actually not an absolute truth, because it does not come from God, but from any one of us. And we don't have the entire knowledge of the universe. So everything that we experience or that we experiment with creates for us a truth, but it's a relative truth. And then Kardec separates relative truths from absolute truth. The absolute ones are the ones that are of divine origin. The relative ones are the ones we discover on an everyday basis, that 2 plus 2 will add up to 4, and so on. Or that if you put this chemical with that chemical, you produce the other compound, the third compound, and so on. Not going to go into the science. What is important for us to understand at this point is how much we can how much credit we should attribute to a revelation, relative or absolute. And the point being here that All the truths that we know are relative ones. Because we don't have the entire knowledge to be able to make an announcement that will stand the scrutiny of time. It will not last forever. If we look at our history of mankind, no matter how important a particular revelation was, a particular discovery was, we always see that later on, either it had to be completely removed and then it was superseded by something else, or it was slightly changed, or it was complemented this or that. This is the nature of our lives. Everything we do here, everything we do today are relative truths. We are learning, and this tells us that because they are relative, that we should keep on always improving ourselves, always analyzing, criticizing, scrutinizing, rationalizing things. Because what I know today will be obsolete tomorrow or a month from now or a year from now. It doesn't really matter when, but it's the point that it will become either obsolete, wrong, or will need to have an update, like some vitamins added to it. And this is very important. And this is now chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. This is a sewing class, by the way. I don't know if Federico told you, but it's a sewing class. We're going to stitch all the chapters together. But I'm going to skip chapter number 3. We're going to hop over it. Just bear with me. Now we move to chapter 4, and that is a very, very odd chapter at first. It's very incongruous. 4 and 5, actually. Because then Kardec starts talking about the old systems that we have, old systems for the universe. And we look at them, and they actually do look incongruous, because Kardec already tells us that he even presents 3 of them and says 2 are wrong already by the standards of the 1850s. Remember, this is almost 150 years ago. So we have to read Genesis with our minds set to the context of that time. We have to keep the context always in our minds. So, but Kardec already tells us out of the 3 that he presents, 2 of them are wrong. So we ask ourselves, why waste time? Paper was very expensive those days. They didn't have e-books. Well, because he is actually giving us examples of what happens when we make a relative truth into an absolute one, or when we force it, because we can't make it. We can try to force it, to coerce it, but we cannot make it. How many people died simply because they had the opposite idea? Or they simply did not believe that it was something wasn't happening one way or another. Let's take, for instance, whether it was the sun that orbit the earth or the earth that orbit the sun. How many people died? Right? Until we got everybody to admit, or at least to accept others, in terms of thinking in a different way. So these chapters are there to show us. It's like the spiritual benefactors are holding us from the shoulders, shaking us and saying, listen, don't think that don't treat these chapters in a very nonchalant way. Because you have been killing people for now 5,000-6,000 years simply because you are trying to coerce them to believe what you believe in. You are trying to make your relative truth an absolute one. Because once it's absolute, everybody has to partake of it. You cannot have an absolute truth and then a second opinion, because then that one is not absolute. But everything we do, everything we discover, everything we interact with, we uncover, we unveil, is relative. So those chapters are there as warning signs. Warning signs. And now we move on to the chapters that people tend to have nightmares about. Chapters 5 through 10. 6 through 10, actually. Which is the uranography, or the creation of the universe. Here, I want to make just a little parenthesis and say that there's a lot of individuals that criticize Genesis because the information is outdated. Well, tell me something that I don't know, or tell me something that is not that obvious. Of course it's outdated. It's 150 years old. You expect it to be exactly what you would have written yesterday? Of course it's not going to be that. If you want updated information about how the universe was put together, you shouldn't read it in Genesis. If you have a toothache, you don't go to the vet, I hope, right? Well, it's as simple as that. So don't come and complain about a book that was written 150 years ago and state that it's out of date. Of course it's out of date. It will not be able to keep up unless Kardec was still alive and making new editions every year, every 5 years. We have unveiled in the last 25 years of our history, the past 25 years, more than we have unveiled in the entire history of humankind put together, with the exception of the last 25. This is how much we have learned in the last 25 years. How much technology has enabled us to peer into places in the universe we didn't know existed, to look into parts of the cell we didn't even know were there, and to look at matter in ways that we never even dreamed of. So of course it's not going to be up to date. But here is the point where we should then, instead of reading and trying to go through a historical process, here is what we do is we present the new ideas. Out of respect for Kardec, and if we want to study the history, what we used to believe in the 1850s regarding the composition of the universe, then we study Kardec, we study some astronomers of the time, and so on. So we start with the Big Bang. Trust me, I'm not going to go into too much science, but we need to say a few things, okay? You will see why they are important. Try to see how much I am attempting to stitch things together. We start with the Big Bang. And the Big Bang is not a theory. The Big Bang is not the last word on it. Even though we say the Big Bang theory or the theory of the Big Bang, all right? You treat the word theory here very casually, very carefully, I would say, not casually, very carefully. The Big Bang is a model. It is a model that we have created based on all the observations that we have made of the universe. This model so far is standing on two legs. But tomorrow an astronomer may make a discovery that will not fit in this model of the Big Bang. And then we'll have to modify this model to become the model of the Big Bang prime, 2 prime, 3 prime, and so on. Or part 1, part 2, or version 1, version 2, and so on. Or we may even say, nope, I don't want to call it the Big Bang anymore. I'm going to call it something else. But the point is, it's a model. As a model, it is a relative truth. And here's the tie to the first chapters. It is a relative truth. We are still working on it. We are still developing it. And how does it go? We start by saying that all we know was concentrated in one point of infinitely small. It was infinitely small, infinitely hot, infinitely dense. Here's the first question. How? Solve it, and perhaps you even change the name of the model or the model altogether. You see how it's already relative? Just from the for the beginning, when you say it's infinitely this, and that, you're already making some assumption because we don't know before that what happened. So it's a relative truth. Somehow that opened up, exploded, burst forth. And from it, all that energy that was concentrated at, we created the very first subparticles. The subparticles created the atomic particles. And the atomic particles created the first atoms, which I will call elements. We're going to be we're going to be just looking at the surface, all right? Don't worry about it. But I want you to see how everything is linked together. When the Big Bang happened, there were only 3 chemical elements that were put together. Hydrogen, the smallest of them all. Then helium, the second smallest one. And lithium, but particularly hydrogen and lithium, hydrogen and helium, right? Again, why? If we look at the periodic table today, we know there's 120, 121 chemical elements. There's a dispute about the last one. It doesn't matter for us. But there's at least 100, let's say. Where are the other ones? You have heard about carbon footprint. You have heard that we are carbon life forms. I didn't say that the universe created carbon, so if I were there right at the Big Bang, I wouldn't be able to put this body together because there was no carbon that was made. So that's another question for you. How? Why? We don't know. Something that we're still investigating. But the point was, now the universe has, let's say for simplicity, hydrogen and helium, and is now distributed. Another question for you. As it distributes, you expect it to distribute evenly, right? Like when you put sugar in your coffee and you mix it, it doesn't matter how many times you sip, or if you sip here and you leave it for 5 minutes and you sip it again, it is as sugary as it was before, right? Because it's an even distribution. The sugar goes everywhere in that solution, as the coffee. But what happens now if you have pineapple juice? You pour the pineapple juice on a glass, right? And you take a sip. And then you let it sit there. Maybe you go, you answer the phone, or you talk to someone. You come back. What happens to the bottom what do you see at the bottom of the glass and at the top of the glass, right? If you take a sip without swirling it first, you just drink water, perhaps water with sugar, but all the pineapple is at the bottom. So there is not an even distribution. It's uneven. This was what happened to the universe at first. The distribution of helium and hydrogen was uneven. The distribution of energy was uneven. We don't know why. But where it concentrated, like the bottom of the glass, where it concentrated, it created gigantic accumulations of gases, hydrogen and helium. We call these nebula. Nebulae, the plural nebulae, are agglomerations of gas, particularly hydrogen and helium. But now if we look inside each one of these nebulae, so if you look at only one nebula, just one of them, we see that the hydrogen and the helium also, even inside, does not distribute itself evenly. Quite the opposite. It accumulates here and there. And just to cut a very long story short, all right? The point is, in a nebula, in one of them, where they are actually accumulating in one particular point because of gravitational fields, gravitational forces, eventually there is so much gas in a particular point. The gas is matter. Matter has mass. If now we have a gravitational field around, that mass becomes weight. It becomes so heavy, so much matter in one place, that it actually ignites. And there you have the birth of a star, like our sun. Although our sun is one of the most miserable examples of a star. It's tiny, but it's enough to provide us with the warmth and the energy that we need for this type of biological life. Just to give you an idea of the sizes, there are suns that are 1 million to 1 billion times the size of ours. And our sun is already enough to put 1 million Earth planets in it. It's gigantic, and yet our sun is considered a tiny one. But now we have suns. We have suns everywhere in this very naive, very young universe. Well, the suns, like everything else in the universe, they have a lifetime. They eventually are going to die. And this is where we come in. Now we have a sun. And if we could slice it in half and look inside, we would think that, first when we look just from the outside, we think a sun is just a furnace. A gigantic furnace, a macroscopic furnace, an astronomical one. But it's a beautiful example of stellar engineering. Because here's what happens. The sun is made of all that gas that creates that spherical shape of it, right? That gas has mass, right? Like anything else we are familiar with here in the physical world. That gas has mass. The sun has a gravitational field that pulls that mass towards its center, weight. So the mass of the gas tends to actually compress the sun, imploding it. It tries to implode, to go inwardly, to force it to collapse in on itself. But as it tries to do that, the gas that is right there in the center is, what we have in the center is a fusion reaction. The forces are so great that the gases fuse together, producing a huge amount of energy and heavier elements. No longer hydrogen and helium, but we start producing beryllium, boron, carbon, oxygen that you have heard of, and so on. Right? So the fusion reaction produces a gigantic amount of energy and tries to blow the star apart to smithereens. But because there is a very delicate balance between the size of the star trying to crush in on itself and the fusion reaction trying to blow it apart, the sun or the star holds its shape, glowing, spewing out energy and light as we know them to do. But then I said that we have to put these bodies together, and these bodies have carbon, right? We breathe oxygen, right? And we have calcium in our bones, correct? We have phosphorus in the form of phosphate in our bones. We have iron that we use to put this building together, and then hopefully it will stay together and in one piece, right? But this is not made by the Big Bang, and it's not made by the star. But here's what happens. As a star consumes the helium and that hydrogen, its fuel, eventually it has no more fuel to consume. But every time it consumed the fuel, it produced a byproduct. Right? The same way that when we burn gasoline in our cars, we produce the gases that come out of the exhaust pipe. That also has mass and is still around the star. So there's still that force trying to push the star inwardly. But once you run out of fuel, that fusion reaction inside stops working. So now there's nothing to counteract that force inwardly. And the star does not explode, it implodes. It collapses in on itself. But as it's doing so, everything that is on the outside moves inwardly. And there's a shock wave. And that shock wave of moving material around inside of the star is so strong that it melts, that it joins, that it fuses smaller chemical elements into larger ones, creating iron, creating calcium, creating phosphorus, everything that we have, that we need to put these physical bodies together. And then the star explodes. And as it explodes, it seeds in every direction those newly formed elements that will later coalesce again by gravitational fields, produce the planets or the non-flammable, let's say, or non-ignitable bodies, or bodies that can no longer burn those chemicals into something else. Those will be planets, asteroids, and so on. And that is the beginning of our world, of our home. You see now how everything is tied together? This is why I had to take this particular path and meander about. We need this little bit of science to be able to realize, oh, I wasn't there at the Big Bang. I didn't even have my building blocks at the Big Bang. I had to have a star being made and then die for me to have my building blocks. So we are stellar children. Everything, every atom in our bodies were put together by a star that died in one point or another of its lifetime. And now we have the planets. The planets will do exactly what we saw for the stars. All right? Now, instead of having to talk about helium and hydrogen, we're going to talk about all the other chemical elements that will coalesce, form a body. Initially, that body will be very hot. Then that body will start to cool down. From the cooling, you're going to start the first weather patterns. From those weather patterns, you're going to create the first concentrations of chemicals in some sort of a prehistoric soup. In that prehistoric soup, the very first chemicals of life are going to start developing. and on and on and on until we form the very first chemical aggregate that is capable of making a copy of itself, called molecular mimicry. That's the birth, the beginnings, the very rudimentary beginnings of reproduction. From that, we are going to move into a very, very rudimentary cell. From that cell, associations of cell. Then that association is going to tighten up. We are going to have, instead of an organism that has only one cell, it is made of many cells together. We call it pluricellular organisms, and on and on and on until we reach ourselves, our stage. So you see, we start with the Big Bang, we go through the nebula, we go to the star creation, then the star death, then the planet creation, the first weather patterns, the erosion of the surface. We create a mixture, a soup, so to speak, of all these chemicals, and these chemicals interact with each other and on until we start forming the very, very first biological attempts at life, to life. Okay? To create life. So all this is what Kardec talks about with the knowledge that he had in the 1850s, which is not actually the knowledge from the 1850s. Remember, when you write a book, you have to read something that has been printed. Not today when we have the internet, right? So he had to get those books to read. Those books were probably 20, 30 years old. So basically, what we have in Genesis is the beginning, the knowledge we had from the beginning of the 19th century, the very beginning of the 1800s. So of course it's out of date. But this is when, as we study the book, we update it in respect to Allan Kardec, to the spiritual benefactors that helped him, dictated the book to him, and for our knowledge. But all this is very nice. But it only tells us the material, the physical part of it. What about the spiritual part? Right? So we also study, and now Kardec moves on to the chapters 11, 12, when he talks about the spiritual genesis, the biological genesis, spiritual genesis, now moving from the physical into the spiritual. And now we also have a model. It is not written in stone, and it's not given to us by God itself. It is a model. And as a model, it is capable, it's feasible to modify it. We are capable of modifying it, adding things to it as we progress. So this model is actually one that divides the creation into two sides. Is the creation divided like that? No, this is just for our understanding of it, to help us. It's a didactical model, all right? So we say that we have one side that is made by the universal cosmic fluid, and another side that is made by the spirit, or that's created, that comes to be through or from the universal principle, or the, not the universal principle, but the intelligent principle or spiritual principle. Everything that is spiritual in nature, non-physical, non-material, spiritual, transcendental, comes from the universal cosmic, but it's come from the spiritual principle side, or the intelligent principle side of the creation. Everything that is material, physical, non-transcendental in this case, comes from the universal cosmic fluid side of the creation. So here we put, in the universal cosmic fluid side, we put matter, antimatter, energy, dark matter, you name it. Spirits are on this side, the side that comes from the spiritual principle or the intelligent principle. But we don't start our journey as spirits, right? We started as a monad, a spirit to be, a spirit in training. And this monad now will associate itself with this part of the creation, the part that is material. It will not be a rock. It will not be a bacterium. It will not be an animal or a plant of any sort. It will be associated to it, controlling, commanding it. This is a big difference. In the same way that we are not this physical body. I am not a human being. I am a spirit who happens to be controlling a physical body at this very moment. We can say we are human beings when we want to discriminate ourselves from the rest that exists on the planet, in the physical realm. But when we want to talk in more absolute terms, I am a spirit who happens to have a physical body that I am controlling at the moment. So this monad, the spirit to be, the spirit in training, is now associating itself with the very first molecules, with the very first aggregates, with the very first mineral forms, and will learn from these forms, from these associations, until it is ready to control something a lot more difficult, a lot more sophisticated, more complex, which is our physical bodies. So that monad will not be the rock, will not be the molecule, will not be anything like that, but will be associated. At first, that monad doesn't really learn as we mentioned, as we understand learning per se. Because learning involves a cognitive ability, right? Like a baby learns. A baby, when they start to walk on all fours, then they're experiencing the world by putting everything in their mouths or by touching everything. They are learning because there is already a very, very small amount of cognitive ability there that allows them to process the information that they gather with their senses. The monad is simple and ignorant. It has nothing. No senses, nothing. It's a blank slate. A tabula rasa, as we say in Latin, a blank slate. Everything has to be written on it. So the monad will, at first, collect information, but will not know what to do with it. Will just collect information. In its associations, in its beginnings, in its incipience, it collects information. But it will collect information and information and information, and eventually it will have something to do with that information. Now, someone might say here, oh, then I can use this as an excuse, because it means that when I was a monad, I took the wrong path, because instead of going A, B, C, D, E like my neighbors, I did A, Z, C, D, E. No. Because at this point, because we're only collecting information, it's as if I asked you to pick up fruits and put it in a basket. And then you would pick up first a pineapple, then an apple, and then an orange. And another person would start with the orange, then the pineapple, and then the apple. In the end, everybody would have the exact same types of fruit and the same number, regardless of the order in which you picked them up. This is the stage the monad is in. Or actually, it's perimonad, if you allow me. Because the monad is the part that is in the spiritual side of the creation, to associate itself with anything that is physical. In the same way that we have a perispirit, the monad has a perimonad. Now this monad gathers enough information, and eventually it starts to do some, as if we could say, a statistical analysis. It will start saying, I have already collected this piece of information. So now in this little box where I put, let's say, apples, I have 2 apples, not just one. So it's not just a fruit. It's the same fruit I have already collected, and on and on. And then from this, we start seeing the very beginnings of a rationalization. A rationalization that eventually will become our intelligence. Then we have all this process for the monad now, collection of information, and the very beginnings of the processing of that information at the level, let's say, of counting. Oh, I've collected more of this than of that event, of that one as opposed to the other one over there, and so on. But the monad cannot, at this point, create an expectation or anything. That comes a lot later in our evolution. As we now begin to inhabit more and more complex life forms, we begin to develop the senses. For instance, we begin to realize that if I go in one direction, right, I can collect more of this event than that event. For instance, let's say that the event that I put in this box is food, and the event that I put in this box is an ugly taste that is coming from the water. It's an ugly chemical that irritates me chemically. So now that little organism, whatever it is, will move itself, it has the ability to, towards the one that is food, that event, and not this one. This is not instinct yet. This is not intelligence yet. It's basically a form of manipulating what to collect. It is not a choice either. And we'll see later on what I mean by choice. We have to be very careful with it. But from this, that little organism will create the first senses, the first sensorial apparatuses. And from there, it will collect even more information, will process now this information until it will develop instinct. The instinct will come, let's say the primordial instinct, as a reaction to whatever is collected. So now I don't only gather information. I don't only gather information and count how many events I have gathered of the same thing. Now I react. So for instance, if I go towards food, perhaps I will swim a little faster. If it's something that is actually, and I'll swim faster towards it. But if now I have something that irritates me, chemically, biochemically, it doesn't matter. Then I'll swim in the opposite, faster, but in the opposite direction. Now there is a reaction to it. A reaction, still not intelligence. But this instinct will be moving forward, will be also progressing, developing slowly as this monad associates itself with better and better forms, biological forms, until it reaches a point where not only can it gather information, count the events of what it is gathering, associate what it has as a background of information with a reaction, but now this little monad in its journey can create an outcome. It's not a prediction, it is an expectation. The monad will probably say to itself, I have already taken this path many times, I always find food there. So if I take it again, isn't it possible that I will find food again? This is the birth of rudimentary form of intelligence. When now I'm not only capable of gathering information, processing that information, but I can create an expectation of an outcome. If I take this path, will I arrive at this event? If I take that path, will I arrive at the other one? And here is kind of interesting, because now that we have this ability to create an expectation of an outcome, that's when we create choice. Because we create the choices. They're not given to us. We are the ones who manipulate the environment to create the choices. So this is also the birth, not only of the rudimentary intelligence, but of choice. And because now we have the birth of choice and rudimentary intelligence, we have free will. Only here we have free will. There is no point in giving free will to a monad who does not know what it does, because then you wouldn't have any responsibility for this or that, or any merit for that matter. It is only here that free will comes into play. And free will is not a gift, is not an endowment, a divine endowment if you prefer. No, it is a natural consequence of our evolutionary path. As we create the ability for ourselves of making choices, creating the choices in the first place, and expectations about outcomes. If I do this, I expect that to happen. If I do that, I expect the other. So when I create all this, I am the one creating my free will. It's not an endowment, not a gift, not a bonus or anything that has nothing to do about merit. We reached a point where we develop it. But only now, and because we develop this free will, because we develop this intelligence, then at this moment, we are promoted to a spirit. We did not change what we were. We did not. It's just a didactical division. I could have called the spirit from the very beginning, or continue to call ourselves monads. All right? So nobody goes to bed one night monad and wakes up a spirit. It's a very long process that takes billions of years. We've been here 1.9 billion years. Let's say 2, just to round it off. 2 billion years in this planet alone, developing, improving ourselves. So this process, it is very gradual. But we put a little stop at one point. We say from this point, backwards we call ourselves monad. From this point onwards, forwards, we call ourselves spirit. But understand that this is not something that happens like that. And it's at this point that we are ready to drive a Ferrari. And we go, and now we are going to associate ourselves with the complex biological structures that we call the human bodies. It is at this point that we are going to develop that physical body, because the very first ones were not anything like we are today. And we are going to develop their cognitive abilities and learn even more. Now we can say we learn, because now we gather information, we process it, we extricate things, we pull things apart, we transform what we understand from the environment, and we create revelations. Relative truth, because now at this stage my background is different from yours, from everyone here. It's not the same. Until I was at the very, very beginning, yes, when I was collecting just the fruits and putting them in a basket, fine. But as I started developing the senses, I started developing the instincts, I started developing my rudimentary intelligence, then I started creating my own paths, my own avenues of progress. So then that's when we divert from each other. We create our individuality as such. And what is all this? How is all this related to Genesis and God? This is very tiring. It's a lot of science, right? Very simple. If I were to give a piece of paper to each and every one of you here, and assuming that everyone here is an accomplished writer, and ask each and every one of you here to write what is your idea of God, without any writer's block. If there are 40 people here, I will get exactly 40 completely different ideas. Because God is a construct of our minds. That is the only way we understand God. God, the true God that we feel inside, the thing that we have respect for, that is so well sedimented, so well put together in our minds that no matter what other people say, it will not break it. The God that we have rationalized to ourselves is a construct, a psychological construct, and as such, it is inherently dependent on these 2 billion years of atavisms and spiritual monadic experiences. We create the concept of God. Now, of course, there are going to be similarities in the concepts around this room, because after all, we progressed roughly on the same planet and things like that. But what is important is that it will have differences. So I cannot say that my concept is better than yours, or that my concept is more encompassing than yours, no, it's my concept. And how did I create this concept? From all the experiences that I have been putting together through all these 2 billion years I have been evolving. So the only way I actually managed to reach the concept of God, this construct, this psychological idea, construct of God, is through science. Because it's the only thing we can grasp, grab, hold. Not necessarily physically grasp, but for instance, when I do math at our level, we understand the 4 plus 4 or 4 divided by 2 and so on. We already understand it, even though it's an abstract concept. We don't necessarily have to have something that is physical, but it is through these little things that we build the world around us. And this world then reveals things to us that become relative truths. And as I put all together these relative truths, the ones that I can understand, I create the concept, the construct of God that I can understand. Because I can come here and give you a beautiful lecture about what God is. And you write everything down and you memorize it, and you'll be absolutely useless. Because there is nothing in you to associate yourself to it. The only true God that you respect, each and every one of you, separately, in your own way, is the one you created for yourself. And is the one that comes from your interactions, not of yesterday, not from this lecture, but your 2 billion years of work that you have been doing. This lecture won't even make a dent on that amount of information you already have. Okay? It's like Bill Gates is losing a penny in Central Park. You might not even realize it. It's in a sense like that. You know, just to put into very, very basic terms without being disrespectful to anyone. Right? So you have been creating this construct yourselves through your entire lives. So it has no point for us to start discussing and arguing, not discussing, arguing with each other which concept of God is better. Because there's no such a thing. And now I'm going to go back to chapter 3 because I remember I told you that I skipped over it. Good and bad are social concepts. If I take you to a deserted island and I put you there and there's no one else there, no TV, no radio, no internet, nothing, can you say there's something good or bad happening to you, that you are doing something good or bad? No. There's a different thing if you say, I can do something healthy or non-healthy, but that's a different story. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about good and bad. Good and bad is an assessment of what is normal, what is the average behavior of a particular group. It's a social concept. But the construct of God only exists in my mind. In your mind, it's yours. In her mind, it's hers, and so on. So I cannot say one is good, one is bad. It's that individual's construct of God. And that construct reflects everything that that individual has created, experienced, experimented with in the past 2 billion years. This is what Kardec wanted to show to us. And he had to go through the scientific part because this is what we can grasp from the physical world. If I come here and I start talking about abstract things left and right, you might listen, of course, but you won't get anything. It's not a question of intelligence or a question of hearing ability. It's just a question that it doesn't resonate inside of you. What resonates is what you have experienced, what you know for yourself. And that comes from the physical world. And to interact with the physical world is science. It doesn't have to be that idea of a scientist with the crazy look, with the eyes, with the glasses, the red eyes because he hasn't slept for 3 or 4 days, in a lab, away from everybody. No. Everything we do, when you go to the supermarket shelf and you pick up 2 products and you look, it's the same, it has, let's say, beans or rice, and you look at them and one is more expensive than the other and you don't see why one should be more expensive, and you take the cheaper one. Or sometimes you take the more expensive one. There is a reason for it. That reasoning process that you use to take one or the other is science. Is your interaction with the world. It doesn't have to be biology, astronomy, chemistry, and so on. It's right there. So then we get to the end of the book, the last few chapters, and this is going to be now a piece of cake because we talk about miracles, predictions. And what Kardec tells us is that no miracles and no predictions. Miracles are basically things we do not understand ourselves, but the one that is carrying them out understands that concept more than we do. So when we think about the miracles in the gospel that were carried out by Jesus, right? We cannot say that we're at the same level he was at the time, not even today, right? So the amount of knowledge that that individual had, that Spirit, Christ, had, and then was manifesting in the person of Jesus, because the Spirit is Christ. That amount of knowledge that Spirit was manifesting through the man Jesus was much more than we could understand, grasp at the time. So it looked to us miraculous. It looked to us that it was derogating the divine laws, but there is no way you can derogate the divine laws. Because then where would our reference point be? If everything can be willy-nilly changed, we can change things the way we want. So these miracles, these fabulous things, and I'm not talking about the charlatans here, right? Let's not waste our time with individuals like that. They're faking things. No. Whenever we see something we do not understand, we have a tendency to say, oh, this is miraculous. Actually, the word miraculous today has lost its original meaning. Today, we use it as a wonderful thing. And everything that we see from science, the moment that someone unveils a discovery to us as the first order revealer, we always have this tendency of saying, this is miraculous. But it's just something that someone else saw, understood before us. With the predictions, is roughly the same thing. The difference here is that when we speak of predictions, we speak of foretelling the future, right? Foreseeing events. But actually, we don't know how much that individual who's doing that can understand. Maybe that individual can see things that we don't. As in a chess game, a very good chess player observing somebody else's game would see from a few movements what type of strategy one player and the other, each player is using. I know nothing about chess besides how to move the pieces, right? I'm terrible at it. So if I look at the same game that chess champion is looking at, we're both observers, I would just see pieces being moved. But that's it. So that other individual, by observing the two players, may say, this is the player that is going to win. It's a prediction, but it's never 100% guaranteed, because that individual may be actually trying to hustle the other one, maybe pretending not to know much until he actually traps the opponent. So we need to be very careful with these things. And this is why they get to the very end of the book, because Kardec had to first establish what revelations are, what absolute versus relative truths are, then how we use this to create the construct of God, to show to us that only God is the absolute truth. And being the absolute truth, everything that emanates from it is absolute. They cannot be derogated. But everything that we experience in trying to reach that construct of God, that absolute one, we don't have an absolute construct of God, but everything that we do to try to reach it is still relative. But we should be careful in our journey not to call things we don't understand miracles, predictions, and so on. Finally, chapter 18, the last one. Time is upon us. And then he speaks of the modification of this planet. And this is probably one of the most difficult chapters to deal with, not because of its content, just because we want things the easiest way possible. Wouldn't it be great, we go to bed one night and then something happens overnight and we wake up and now Earth is a planet of regeneration as opposed to a planet of atonement? That's what we try to do. And that's what we've been seeing all over, right? We had the 2012 scare, we had this, we had that. We're going to go and some of us are going to ascend as, I don't know, fourth dimensional being. I always wonder, what do they mean by that? Anyway, there's so many things that people say, so many words that are just thrown out there and we swallow them. This is why they do this, because we are the ones swallowing them. So it's not going to be like that. Those of you who have reached the end of chapter 18, have reached the end of the book, if you tell me, oh, this book is wonderful, Kardec finishes it with a message of hope, I'll say, go back to the beginning, read it again, because you got nothing out of it. It is not it's not a message of hope. It's a statement of fact. If you experience with the world, if you change yourself, if you evolve, you will help those around you to evolve as well. And when your numbers reach a larger number than the ones who do not want to do so, the planet doesn't become a planet of regeneration. We make it so. We make the earth a planet of regeneration. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. When we decide to work on ourselves, when we decide to improve ourselves, when we decide to leave behind our petty little schemes, our petty little disputes, then we will amass numbers large enough to move this planet into a different category. But it's not that the planet goes to the category and then we all of a sudden, poof, becomes better individuals. And those of us who are not going to fit, who do not fit in this program, will have to go someplace else because they will not feel comfortable here. They will not feel comfortable in the same way that we go to places where we feel comfortable, where we are amongst peers, not superiors or inferiors, unless we have a complex of, commander or something. We like to commandeer people and things, or we like to order people about. But we like to be with peers, with those who think like us. So those individuals who not match this, the new form of being in this planet, will go someplace else. But it is definitely not something that it would be given to us, bestowed upon us, endowed to us. If you don't do anything, it will continue to be the planet it is right now. And then once people start saying, why did Kardec said the title is Time is Upon Us? Because it gives this idea that it's going to happen tomorrow, right? And this is probably why a lot of people think it's this way. No, it's because we have to understand that we have been in the dark for a very long time in our history as a human beings. And it was industrial revolution that allowed us to detach ourselves from growing food or going after food. Until then, most of humanity was basically surviving. With the appearance of machines, a lot more could detach themselves and start thinking, start producing art, start elaborating hypotheses, testing those hypotheses. These allowed our brains to free ourselves from the basic needs of sustenance and focus on higher things, on higher order things. So Industrial Revolution helped us. It is in this sense that Kardec says time is upon us, because we're now after the Industrial Revolution. We are not talking about people living someplace else 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. If it didn't rain, that was it. There was no market you could go because your neighbor also didn't have anything to sell. Not today. We can help one another. The entire world is linked. So when there is a crisis in one area, food can be brought to that area. Medicine can be brought to that area. We are no longer suffering the local variations of climate, the local variations of the infrastructure of the planet or anything. We can associate, we can interact with one another. This came with technology. Without it, We wouldn't have this possibility. It's in this sense that time is upon us. Now we have everything for us to detach ourselves from this simple life of just caring for our nourishment and start talking about our spiritual nourishment. This is what Genesis represents to us. The explanation of how we come about the construct of God and how we can use it to understand our lifetime, or lifetimes if you think all the way from the modern to every reincarnation process, and how we can stitch this all together and see how beautiful this tapestry of the creation is, and that we are not a thread, but we are part of the picture, so that if one pulls that thread out, we cease to exist. This tapestry has to remain intact. And until we realize that, until we see that we are not a thread or a piece or a corner, but we are the whole thing, and every piece of it also at the same time, we will not have as much respect for it. And we will remain with only the relative truths that we have put together up to now. Until we change ourselves, we will stay here with this in a planet that is a planet still of atonements, a planet of sufferings. We will not contribute for the planet to become a planet of regeneration, but a better society. And we will not be able to move forward in that construct of God. And some of us, we will see it as someone who is belligerent, someone who's aggressive, someone who's this or that, which is completely incompatible with whatever it is that put together this amazing puzzle for us. It's a puzzle because it gave to us the pieces so we could ourselves put them together little by little, and one day be able to look at the picture that it forms. So I think that's about it that I had for you. I just have a message, because Adilson here said that if I didn't read this message, that he wouldn't let me get out of this room alive today. This is a message that I wrote when we finished. It's going to be 3.5 minutes, so bear with me. I know it's hot, and I appreciate that you stayed until the very end. It's a message that I wrote when we finished the study of Genesis at SGNY. It took us about 3.5 years to go through the entire book, 1 day a week, 2 hours, about an hour and a half actually. It's a very dense book. Okay, so I'll start reading the message. At one point, I'll put the presentation. Brothers and sisters, it was the dawn of times for us when we came into existence from the hands of our Creator. Pure, simple, and ignorant, it took billions of years for us to arrive at our current stage of sentience and awareness. Thousands of years have since come and gone, flooding our existence with opportunities for growth and improvement, during which we have unremittingly struggled for our liberation from the shackles of ignorance. In striving to improve ourselves, we have taken the wrong turn many times and have ended down paths that led us to dark alleys of error and deep abysses of despair. Failure upon failure, we have tested many avenues, treaded many roads, and experienced several burdens. Nevertheless, the Creator, in its magnificence, has decreed for all times that none of its creatures shall remain condemned to distress for eternity. Children of perfection, we are to become aware of our flawless constitution on our own terms, so we may deserve the merit of being the artisans of our own excellence. And so it is that the Creator provides us with what is necessary for this journey of discovery. Yes, I say discovery because, being created by perfection itself, we were already perfect at the moment of our incipience. It is merely reserved for us now to realize our state and behave accordingly. Therefore, it is in this manner that we shall rise with every injunction of the Almighty, with every new opportunity for progress, with all the favorable circumstances that its emissaries, the spiritual benefactors, mold and shape into the realities of our lives. Our education process is long and alternated between physical and spiritual experiences, despite our existence as a single, indivisible being. At our present level of understanding and achievements, we must accomplish ourselves in both of them in order to complete our learning and our comprehension of the whole. It is divine providence that wants us to be one with the whole, one with the creation, one with the Creator. We have therefore been forging the crucible of our own rational faith in the course of millennia. It is time we melded our spirit in it, wherefore separating away the impurities of ignorance, envy, jealousy, and pride, and from the residue may we cast our spirit clad in the light of immaculate, unadulterated, universal love. It is our journey, our existence. However, when we place too many reference points in our lives, time becomes the manifestation of our innermost fears and prevents us from marching forward. Let us free ourselves from these references. Let us have only one orientation in our compass: perfection. And time will cease to be the relentless predator of our energies, and it will become a nourishing psychological construct to our faith. Faith, which has to be rationalized, analyzed, scrutinized, revolutionized incessantly. If the Creator is in perpetual creation, the universe is a bubbling cauldron of activity. Why should our faith be otherwise? Therefore, to apprehend the subtleties of the divine work, we must strive to question and evaluate at all times. As we started our studies with the Spirit's book, the very first book of the codification of the Spiritist doctrine, we found ourselves in the ingresses of a vast chamber, the knowledge atrium of the universe. Simple and ignorant of the truth of the creation then, we began our journey through the myriad of concepts that one day shall afford us significant participation in the creation mechanism itself. So time is upon us, time to bloom. It is the will of our Creator that we should grow, that we should not remain in the stage of a seed. We must find courage and strength to break through the shell of our ignorance and germinate with the knowledge we collect from the garden of the universe. Let us bask in the warmth of our Creator's love and justice, from whence we shall grow towards the sun of our liberation through perseverance and wisdom. We are destined to fulfill the universal laws, which, being perfect themselves, demand nothing less than perfection from ourselves. Ours is a great journey. Let us emancipate ourselves through our moral attributes, embellishing the creation with the perfume of our blessings, the colors of our thoughts, the fruits of our actions, the refreshing shade of our branches in the service of the weary travelers. Let us extend the fruits of our wisdom and love to our brothers and sisters in need, so no one shall ever be thirsty or hungry for solace or consolation. We shall never excuse ourselves from fraternal assistance by alleging lack of strength. The Creator, which permeates everything, will come and renew our reserves by attaching a new fruit of love for each one that is plucked from our branches. And as we allow love to course through us, the Creator itself will flow through us, producing a wave that will steer us to further accomplishments. This is the law of progress, the movement of the divine Creator through its creature, which is then driven to strive even more so by the very same process to which the Spirit gives rise. Here, we see the application of the teachings of Christ when he stated that even more would be given to those who already had plenty, for the flow of love is what generates the law of progress, which in turn motivates the Spirit. This force is everywhere, unstoppable, everlasting, and despite our still puerile attitude towards free will, no one can deny knowledge of this law forever, for it's a universal law which emanates directly from the Creator, and it is the wish of the Almighty that we should join the creation in all its plenitude. It is on these terms that we finish our journey through the fifth and last book of the codification of the Spiritist doctrine, dictated by our spiritual friends and benefactors who have preceded us in the great journey towards perfection, and who participate today in coordinating the great stage we call the universe. Almost 150 years ago, Hippolyte Léon Denisard Rivail, whom we have come to know as Allan Kardec, finished this book not with a message of hope, but rather a statement of certainty that the future is ours to make. And throughout the universe, his resounding spiritual voice is heard by all who are willing to sacrifice the present for the glory of the eternal plenitude that awaits us tomorrow, next to the Creator of all things.